right, welcome back. This is now part three of your chapter 7 of your film lecture. Again, I'm actually stretching this out to 4 parts so as not to have you have to sit here for an hour and watch me and listen to me talk. I know that's kind of a tough thing to do, so hopefully by breaking this up into shorter parts, that's a helpful thing for you. But let's start talking about part 3. So obviously, we've talked a lot about. In the first 2 parts, we've talked about economics. We talked about who's going to a film. We've talked about how box office was affected, pre-COVID and post-COVID, and everything in between. Now, what I want to do is circle back and really kind of talk about the history of film, which I think, again, I love history. And we have a historical aspect in every form of mass communication we do, and film is no different. And so why don't we let me get fired up here on history and start talking to you about everything from the 19th century when film gets started to basically the end of the 1930s. And then after the 1930s will be part 4. All right. Well, first of all, film, motion pictures, right? You've heard that term. The interesting thing about motion pictures, right, is that it's pictures, it's still images. And one of the great things about having a brain, human brain, is that our brain actually it can be tricked, or at least, I guess, encouraged to look at still images that move quickly through into motion, right? So the fact is that motion pictures don't actually move. They're actually a series of still images, right? And when still images are run through a projector at a correct speed, we'll talk about who created all this stuff. The viewer perceives an illusion, I should say, of smooth motion. So film can be traced back to photography. So in the early to mid 19th century, photographs were on plates, but a gentleman named George Eastman, he is mentioned in your textbook. He developed a flexible celluloid roll film that made motion pictures technically feasible, that you could pull through or like run through an actual projector so that we could actually enjoy film. And of course, shout out George Eastman. We'll also talk about Thomas Edison here in a bit, because he was also an instrumental part of kind of the process of learning of film being sort of brought into this amazing mass medium, right? But there's also something that has to do with our brain that had to have we had to have already built in order for this stuff to work. And so there's 2 terms I want you to be familiar with. One is called the pi phenomenon. The other one is called persistence of vision. And the pi phenomenon is where we see one light source go out while another one close to the original is illuminated. So think about seeing a marquee, right? Maybe you've seen one of those old Vegas marquees, or maybe maybe there's a business or a restaurant, or maybe you've seen it in an arcade at Six Flags or whatever, where you see a river of lights, and the river appears to be moving. The lights appear to be moving around the marquee. Well, it's not really moving. What's happening is one light's turning on, turning off. The other one, split second later, is turning on, turning off, and next to it, and so on. And that is basically giving us the illusion that we're seeing that light move almost like a river. All right. So the pi phenomenon is where we see one light source go out while another one close to the original is illuminated. And to our eyes, it looks like the light is moving from one place to another. The other one is called persistence of vision. And this one really shout out to my animators out there. One of the cool things about our brain is that our eye retains an image for a certain length of time. So we actually retain an image for a split second. And if we are rapidly presented with one image after another, the visual persistence of the first image fills in the time lag between the 2 images. So basically, we see an image, it's still image, and there's another still image, another still image, another still image, and we literally start to blend that together like it's motion. So the easiest way to think about that is if you've ever had a flip book, or if my animators have ever done character drawing, where they draw a character and then they draw the character, and a lot of this is done digitally, of course, now. But if you do hand-drawn animation, maybe 3rd or 4th grade, I remember I did it, you draw like a stick figure and then you move the stick figure ever so slightly and then ever so slightly. Or maybe you were taking like still like you had a camera that you could take stills with, and then the stills, eventually would be put together to look like motion. It's a flip book, right? Persistence of vision. So it looks like your character is moving. And that's the same thing that's happening when you're taking film through a camera, through a device. You're taking still images that are rapidly being put together that then create motion, and it fools our brain into thinking that we're seeing motion. Super cool, right? Called persistence of vision. Now, there is a gentleman who understood this philosophy, the I guess physics, if you will, or scientific I don't know, processes, I guess. His name was Edward Muybridge, and he was known for his pioneering works in the studies of motion. He was actually, interestingly enough, he was he was the first to catch a film, a horse in stride with, and he used it with 24 cameras on a racetrack. And I want to show you a video here. It's interesting. He had a great, interesting life. He was involved in a very expensive bet, if you will, with the former governor of California, Leland Stanford. And he really is he was like kind of the pioneering force in motion. And it's his experiments that kind of led to what we consider could be modern film. So I'm going to stop sharing here for a second and show you this video on my other screen right here. And this is more on Edward Muybridge.
When Edward Muybridge began, photography was a relatively new medium. The pioneering photographers of his time had to essentially invent their own cameras and their own chemistry. Muybridge began his career making pictures of Yosemite, taking his bulky camera and portable darkroom through the valley's rough terrain to the high peaks where he could capture the landscape's dramatic heights and plunging chasms. To achieve the shots he wanted, he took his camera out to precipices where his assistants wouldn't dare follow. At this time, a controversy prevailed among experienced horsemen as to whether all the feet of a trotting horse were clear of the ground in the same instant. To settle the debate, the railroad magnate Leland Stanford hired Muybridge to photograph his prize racehorse, Occident, at a trot. Muybridge constructed a track specifically for the purpose. Multiple cameras were lined up, each connected to a wire stretched across the track. As the horse hit each wire, a camera was triggered to capture an instant in time. Horses on merry-go-rounds and an academic painting had long been represented with all feet off the ground, stretched out in front and back. Muybridge's pictures proved something else, that the feet do leave the ground at once, but when they're under the horse's body. These photos caused a great sensation. Meissonier, a celebrated painter of horses, is said to have wept when he saw Muybridge's photographs. It was the first time that such rapid motion could be seen like this, thin slices of time, quicker than anything the human eye could perceive. Muybridge experimented with the optical gadgets of the time, the zoetrope, thaumatrope, and phenakistoscope, and he created something he called the zoopraxiscope, a precursor to cinema. It showed his still images in rapid sequence, reanimating the still photos, and cast the image on a wall. Some would say that the only thing lacking was the sound of the hooves pounding the ground, or they would have believed that horses were really running through the room. His work required him to travel extensively. When he'd been away from San Francisco for a time, he returned to find that his wife, Flora, had been conducting an affair with the local theater critic, Harry Larkins. Stricken, Muybridge got on a ferry, went to Calistoga where the lover was hiding, and shot Larkins dead. He was put on trial for murder. If found guilty, he would go to the gallows. His attorney mounted an imaginative defense, with friends and associates offering examples of Muybridge's benign madness. The attorney introduced pictures from Yosemite, showing Muybridge perched at a precarious height, as evidence of the photographer's questionable mental state. The jury pronounced Edward Muybridge not guilty and not mad. He would live to create hundreds more of the motion studies of people performing various tasks and movements, of horses and other animals. His innovations in photographic technology formed the very foundation of cinema. Every movie you see today, and every animation, owes something to the legacy of Edward Muybridge.
All right, so that's a really interesting video on Edward Muybridge, who obviously is instrumental in motion and why it matters to film, right? In any event, he produced over 100,000 animals in motion, or I should say, like whatever experiments, right? In any event. But he wasn't the only one that was instrumental in the history of film. We also have Thomas Edison, who you've heard of before. We heard about Thomas Edison, of course, when we were talking about the sound and recording in Chapter 4. I think that was Chapter 4, off the top of my head. And he had obviously introduced what was called the phonograph, and eventually which became the record player, which became obviously the medium of music, right? Or at least commercial music. I mean, it started with Thomas Edison. And basically, Thomas Edison and an assistant actually developed a reliable projection system, obviously using the principles of Muybridge of 24 frames. But what's interesting is he was too cheap to spend $150 to patent his idea. So machines were quickly duplicated and patented in Europe. And that would be an important factor later on in the development of Hollywood. But we'll get back to that in just a minute. But he did, I have a typo there. He created something called the kinetoscope. In fact, I can change that, I think. Get rid of that P there, guys. There we go. He created the kinetoscope, a small projection system that housed 50 feet of film that revolved on spools. He saw it, though, as a single-person viewing system that you would literally look through like an eyepiece, essentially, and you would watch a very simple thing of motion, and that would be entertaining. And, of course, that's not what wound up happening. His business model was flawed because it wound up being something that later would turn into watching it, screen in a theater amongst friends and family and people, and it became, a form of mass media, right? Well, that's not what he started out to do, which is interesting because he kind of did the same thing, if you remember, in Chapter 4 when he created his like dictation device. It was meant to be like an answering machine, and it wound up being what later became a record player. So, in any event, I'm getting a weird flashing light on my camera up here. I hope everything's okay. All right, so let's keep going on. Maybe you missed, maybe it cut out there for a second. I'm not sure. It went yellow, now it's green again. We'll see. Anyway, Edison didn't see projecting the image to large crowds, but rather one person at a time. So his business model was flawed. But he is credited with inventing what would later become a major part of film. The Lumière brothers, also very important. They come along. And of course, one of the things between the Lumière brothers and Edison was the very first iterations of motion were just simple. People juggling, just motion in general. And it basically then people started saying, we want a story, right? The idea of actually creating something that you could watch and follow. And again, the American public, the global public at this point, very used to watching live theater, for example. And it was the idea of turning live theater into something on screen. So the Lumière brothers were really kind of the first to project film on a large screen, if you will, in Paris. It lasted about 50 seconds. It's a train arriving at a station, and I want to show it to you real quick. Let me get it queued up over here. And I want you to think about when we watch movies these days, whether we watch them in the theater, we watch them on Netflix, on TV, whatever. Think about story and think about this story and see if you can spot a dramatic difference here. So anyway, here is, I'm going to share the Lumière brothers and the story behind it. So here you go. So obviously, riveting stuff, right? The Lumière brothers, a train arriving in a station, and I do mean that is what we watched, a train arriving in a station. Now, of course, if we were in person together, I would actually ask you, "Hey, what do you think?" And what are the story? What amazing movie? And there'd be like a lot of dead stares at us. And I'm like, "What's it lacking?" Well, it's lacking a story. It's lacking close-ups, it's lacking medium shots, all the things that we think about when we watch and maybe don't even appreciate when we're watching like modern film or just modern video. But in 1895, no one had seen this before. So there's stories of the audience in France when this was on. There was, of course, that sound that you heard, the piano, that was actually being played live because there was no sync sound at that point, meaning there was no sound connected to the film. That sound was actually being played separately with the film playing so that the two would, it would kind of add to the experience. You had people diving under the chairs. They thought the train was coming through the wall. I remember very vividly, like VR for virtual reality, like experiencing that for the first time. I did that like 10 or 15 years ago. And, I was at this place down in Irvine that was doing this like cutting edge stuff that no one had ever seen. And I remember like having those goggles on and seeing that and just going, whoa, and I can only imagine what it must have been like if you were a citizen on Earth and didn't have any experience in motion on screen, motion in general. And then all of a sudden, boom, there it is in this theater in France. Pretty cool, actually. So anyway, that's the train arriving in the station. Now, Edison's lab eventually created what was called the Vitascope. So Edison, even though his business model was flawed initially, very quickly caught on to the fact that, had people around him that understood that this was a much different product. It was going to be a game-changing form of mass communication. They created a large screen system. It enabled film strips of longer length to be projected without interruption. And it led to an evolution of narrative films. Early narrative filmmakers, George Millet, Vanishing Lady and A Trip to the Moon, very famous around 1903. Again, a lot of these were, if you Google them or go on YouTube and search, some of these things, basically you can see just how primitive they were. By the way, just as an aside, right next door to COC is a film archive. It was, it's a $30 million building. And the curator over there once told us during a tour that like only about 15 to 18% of all films made prior to 1920 actually still exist. A lot of them, basically deteriorated, fell apart, lost forever. And so you think of all these incredibly like short films or these just films that were made prior to 1920 and they're just gone. And so that's why film preservation is so key. And that's why this place is next door to preserve film. But in any event, yeah. So like when I think of like early film, these films in the early 1900s, and these films, by the way, were one-reel films, real as in REEL, and they were basically anywhere from like 10 to 12 minutes, and that was the extent of your film. There was not a 2-hour or 3-hour film that we know it today. That doesn't come along yet. So Edwin S. Porter really kind of takes the next sort of step up as an American filmmaker. He had The Life of an American Fireman. He had something called The Great Train Robbery. I think you may have heard of The Great Train Robbery if you have any kind of film history at all. And basically, if you compare the Great Train Robbery, in a sense, to the train arriving at a station, I don't want to play it for you because it might get taken down for copyright, but you're certainly welcome to Google Edwin S. Porter Great Train Robbery. But what you see is you actually start to see a story develop. It's about these guys that basically rob a train. The movie starts with, kind of the ticket counter, and then it cuts away to the train, and then inside the train. And, maybe the first 3 minutes, there's about 4 edits, but the fact is there's editing within that film. And so you now start to see kind of the early inclination of what film will wind up being. But Porter shot narrative scenes out of order. He filmed the first close-up. He introduced the Western genre and chase scenes, and of course, later could put these things in order. So that was Edwin S. Porter. All related to what are called Nickelodeons. Those were really kind of the first popular theater. It's a name that combines admission price with a Greek word for theater, and obviously a channel on cable, right? But they were often converted storefronts. They would basically, essentially, pay a cheap rent. They'd put seats in there. They'd put a piano in there that you could play live music on. They would continually show these short films because one thing the audience really demanded was a change in film, right? Because if you're watching the same 10-minute film over and over and over again, not really a winning business, strategy. And basically, the charge was 5 cents for admission. And thus Nickelodeon, right? 5 cents. And by 1910, first investors made $1,000 in a week. By 1906, 1,000 were in operation. And by 1910, they had an estimated gross at $91 million. That was really the high point of what are called Nickelodeons, because shortly thereafter, which I'll introduce here in a minute, the idea of a longer film came along. But most of these early theaters were in the hearts of northeastern industrial cities. And you can see that they were transcended language barriers, meaning that this was also a time when we had mass immigration coming from Northern Europe. A lot of folks that were coming over here in the United States English was not their first language, so they were just learning the language. And so what's one thing that transcends that? Well, if you see a story on screen where people are doing things, you can kind of start to really kind of enjoy it without necessarily knowing like 100% what's going on from a language standpoint. And again, these films were not really designed with a lot of dialogue. They were basically, because there was no sync audio at this point. It was music being played over a film with maybe a slate or slates of words. But in general, you could very easily follow along with the story, even if you didn't know the language. And that was, of course, very popular for someone where English was their second language. In any event, back to Thomas Edison, because he kind of plays a key in film history. So prior to late World War I, which would have been prior to 1916, 17-ish, the film industry was really centered on the East Coast. And it was actually limited to, and one of the reasons why films were limited to only like 12 minutes is because this group led by Edison, the Motion Picture Patents Company, which was limited to just the 10 biggest film companies, they held patents to virtually all the existing filmmaking and exhibition equipment here in the U.S. And they also believed in a lot of different things. They believed in the fact that the customer, the paying customer, would be okay with just coming and watching 12-minute films. It didn't necessarily identify with actors nor directors. It was just basically they would be fascinated with story and the other stuff that goes into that we are so accustomed to now with the whole star, someone who's a star or a great director, right? We might go see that film because of that person. That was all downplayed by this group, this MPPC group. And so basically they ran the production and distribution of film in the US, and they were a monopoly. And so that was Edison's group up until about World War I or through the middle of World War I, because at a certain point, filmmakers, particularly independent filmmakers who could not get into this clique, essentially fled to the West Coast. And one of the things that they did was, because because his group held over 1,000 patents in the United States, but they didn't, again, they didn't in Europe, remember, because he didn't patent it originally when he created this stuff in the 19th century. Well, a lot of that stuff on a parallel universe had been created in Europe as well. And so these independent filmmakers came out here to the West Coast. They were using European equipment that wasn't part of Edison's group or the patent in Edison's group. And the judges on the West Coast were not as eager to uphold Edison patents, which eventually expired. Not to mention the weather out here was conducive to year-round shooting with diverse scenery. And of course, you all know that you know, when you watch a scene for any movie or TV show, they can turn just about anything into anything. You know, I mean, this campus here, COC, has been, I think, used as Seattle. There was a whole series that was quote unquote shot in Seattle that was actually shot here on campus. They just changed the signage, right? Land was cheap and plentiful at one point out here. Not anymore, but it was at one point. And the business model totally flipped. In other words, now you had, you know, stars like really becoming, you know, kind of this, and directors becoming sort of the big deal, right? So a couple of examples: Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford were getting paid $150 a week. I'm sorry, Chaplin was getting paid $150 a week in 1913, and by 1917 he was paid $1 million for 8 pictures. Pickford's salary climbed from $1,000 a week to $20,000 a week, and 50% of the film's profits, making so much money, in fact, the two of them, that they unified and created United Artists, a studio here on the West Coast in 1919. Adolf Zucker created Paramount Studios, which combined production and distribution functions into one corporate structure. So all the money shifting from east to west. So I thought that was very interesting. Now, we talked about length of and narrative style, right? And after Edison's people lose power, and you start to see this idea of the power shifting to the studio, shifting to the actor, shifting to the director, shooting this idea of broadening your entertainment model, you start to see this idea of, why are we doing 12-minute films when we can be doing longer films? And so you had this director who kind of went the opposite direction. And what is arguably one of the most interesting stories, but also one of the most controversial stories in film history, if you follow this, his name is D.W. Griffith, and he made a film called The Birth of a Nation. And if you've heard of Birth of a Nation, you may have heard of it in terms of its innovative style, but you probably have more heard about it because it has a darker side to it, which I'll get into here in a second. But suffices to say, it's the most influential silent film ever made, and it was 3 hours. That's how the running time on it was 3 hours. It took 15 weeks to produce. I have a couple of other notes here on it, I think. Did I miss it? 1 second. I think it's here in my notes somewhere. Yeah, here we go. It established film as an art form, and it was the first feature-length film of over 60 minutes. It was also the most popular film of its time until Gone with the Wind came along. It was a Civil War drama, so it introduced like basically history as a topic, which was also innovative. But here, let me give you the good before I give you the ugly here. It was the most expensive movie to make of its time, $110,000. It was shot without a script. Griffith spent 6 weeks with rehearsal, another 9 weeks shooting it. Why is it so important? Well, the movie used editing, simultaneous action, and close-ups. It was distributed to theaters, complete with an orchestral music score. Admission was $3. That's $3 back in like 1915, which I can't imagine what that must be like here. Anyway, it was absolutely the most popular film, and every film that has since come, from that, anything we watch has a lot to do with what D.W. Griffith introduced. Now, that's the good. The ugly. It was a incredibly racist film by today's standard, atrociously racist. Basically, it painted the pre-war South as a happy and idyllic place. Civil War, by the way, where war throws it into chaos. Basically, what it does is it says the Confederacy is good, the Confederacy is just, and obviously the North and blacks and slaves not good. Obviously, I want to play a video for you because it has, like, I think more of a kind of a succinct definition for you. But this is Birth of a Nation and why it is got such a not just interesting, but so much that surrounds it in terms of its legacy. So anyway, let me fire it up here for you.
Released in 1915, D.W. Griffith's A Birth of a Nation is one of the most important films in cinema history and is considered to be the birth of the American film industry. It's hard to overstate the impact that this film had both on the medium of film itself and on culture as a whole. The film was responsible for some major leaps in film technology, including the first scene shot at night by use of phosphorus lamp, along with new developments in editing technique and camera movements. But culturally, however, the film carries somewhat of a darker legacy. Even in 1915, the film was met with controversy. Showing of the films were protested by the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People for its portrayal of black people. Executive Secretary of the NAACP, Mary Childs Nerney, wrote, "The harm that it is doing to coloured people cannot be estimated. I hear echoes of it everywhere I go, and I have no doubt that this was in the mind of the people who are producing it." The film's portrayal of black people was so terrible that it was still being used as a recruitment tool for the Ku Klux Klan as late as the 1970s. With a runtime of just over 3 hours, the film is split into two halves, separated by an intermission. The first half is set at the outbreak of the Civil War. It follows two families, the Northern Stonemans and the Southern Camerons. It shows us their intertwined lives as they fight throughout the war. It's filled with spectacular battle scenes and ends with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and a defeated South having to face harsh treatment at the hands of a victorious North. The second half of the film focuses on the reconstruction of the South after the war and the glorious origin of the film's supposed heroes, the Ku Klux Klan. The film shows South Carolina just after the war being occupied by black Union soldiers who push white people off sidewalks and are sexually aggressive towards white women. In one scene, a young white girl jumps to her death to avoid being pursued by a black man who is looking to force her into marriage. Black supremacists rig an election by intimidating white voters and stuffing ballot boxes, and the newly elected black legislators are depicted barefoot in the State House of Representatives, drinking whiskey and eating fried chicken. Meanwhile, our hero, Ben Cameron, sees a group of white children putting on sheets to pretend to be ghosts in order to scare black children, and is inspired to form the Klan to fight back. By the end of the film, the Klan have regained control of their town from the black oppressors, and on the next election day, they form a line to intimidate black voters and finally restore power. Despite the film's overall message of overt racism, it was still incredibly popular. It remained the highest grossing movie of all time until it was replaced by Gone with the Wind in 1939. It was even the first film to be shown in the White House to President Woodrow Wilson. On a technical level, the film surpassed anything else that came before it. By making use of new editing techniques like parallel editing, cutting between two different scenes that were happening at the same time, the film managed to show a huge scope of story, cutting from the battleground to families praying at home and then back to the battle. This wasn't just something that was happening to a small group of people. This was happening to the whole country. Griffith found new uses for close-ups, cutting tight to an actor's face to show their emotion, lending depth and pathos to the acting. With clever editing and camera work, Griffith managed to make a few hundred extras look like an army of thousands for epic battle scenes. By moving the cameras around the battleground, Griffith was able to produce a sense of space that seemed to span for miles, and his pioneering use of long panoramic shots lent a sense of scale to the action that audiences had never seen before, and helped cement the film's enduring popularity. As well as technical innovations, Griffith also brought innovations to story and narrative. Unlike the films which preceded it, Birth of a Nation told multiple stories at once. Cross-cutting told the audience how one event affected multiple people, and the first use of flashbacks gave context to story. The whole film tied interweaving narratives into one rousing climax in a way that had never been done in film before. Birth of a Nation changed film history and also set the template for the modern motion picture. Griffith was able to produce epic battle sequences unlike anything people had ever seen before. His use of close-up and intermixed narrative produced powerful drama that captured the audience. It showed a generation of filmmakers what was possible to capture on film, that you could tell grand stories on an epic scale. And it remains to this day one of the most influential films ever made. But its overall message is one of racial bigotry, in which black people are painted not just as lazy and unintelligent, but also as criminals who sexually assault women. So what do you think? Can you call a movie bad just because its message and implications are morally abhorrent? Or is it the technical skill within a film, its beauty, and the talent and artistry that went into it that's more important? How should we view Birth of a Nation today? Let me know what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe as we travel.
All right, so that is the story of Birth of a Nation. Assume you're still watching this video. And it makes you reflect, doesn't it? About, when you see a movie like Birth of a Nation, obviously with its clearly being a racist film, but at the same time, you cannot deny that D.W. Griffith, in many ways, really moved the needle in terms of just modern filmmaking. So really kind of a interesting juxtaposition, if you will. Anyway, we move on. Into the 1920s we go. Between 1914 and 1924, the cost of a feature film increased 1,500%. In fact, by 1927, the average film cost about $200,000 to make. Ben-Hur in 1925, by the way, was made for a reported $6 million. That's in 1920. Think about that, because Godfather was made for the same amount of money some 50 years later. So that really kind of puts it in perspective. Obviously, lots of money in Hollywood during this time led to wealth and questionable decisions, which led to the film industry being cleaned up. A couple of examples, by the way. This is, of course, during the Prohibition era, where bootleg whiskey was very much in play. It was kind of intertwined with the Hollywood culture. In 1922, Fatty Arbuckle was involved in a rape case. 2 other female stars implicated in the murder of a prominent director. So, just not a good look for Hollywood. And so the federal government actually stepped in to clean it up. Jazz singer, very interesting. Very interesting story here. I guess you could say this would be kind of part 2 of our, which is when we talk about just how society was just different back in the, I think everyone talks about whether society is, in 2026 is, if it's, pervasively racist. And I point to the fact that if you go back 100 years, I think that era would have said, hold my beer in a way. Obviously at Birth of a Nation. Well, Jazz Singer was also in that vein, but Jazz Singer was made by a studio called Warner Brothers, which at the time, which of course now Warner Brothers is big time, but back then it was trying to break into Hollywood's kind of big four. There had been big four studios that were part of Hollywood, which we'll talk about here in a second. But number 5 would be Warner Brothers, and they were trying to find an innovative way to draw audiences in. And so up until 1927, if you went and saw a film, there was no what's called sync audio. You would just see music. There was no dialogue. It was all done on slate, etc. And then we have the Jazz Singer make its debut with Al Jolson, a white man, by the way, vaudevillian, not just an actor, but kind of a vaudevillian actor, which vaudeville at that time was known for using blackface. And so, again, warning that this is not exactly racially sensitive, but I think it's important to talk about because of its implications toward what are called talkies, right? The idea of using sound on film. So this is Al Jolson And I won't play the whole thing, but I'll play some of it for you. Let me go here and share, and let's go to Al Jolson. All right, here we go.
The sunshine went right away. The sunshine went. My heartstrings are tangled around.
All right, so there is a little excerpt of Al Jolson in 1927, part of the Jazz Singer. And basically, the reason he is obviously important is, and that movie is important because it's the first time that we see a actual movie with sync sound, with a character on stage or on screen uttering dialogue, and you can actually hear it. And basically, it helped Warner Brothers punch through into the restrictive studio system. And just to tell you how influential that was, basically, within 2 years, silent film was all but dead because of that innovation. And it, for Warner Brothers, came along at just the perfect time because if you know history, just 2 years later, in October of 29, we have the stock market crash happened in October of 1929. The Great Depression begins, where you have 1 out of every 4 Americans out of work, which had a profound effect on all sorts of different forms of mass communication. And it basically helped insulate Hollywood from the start of the Depression, which led to the golden age of Hollywood. Shout out Al Jolson, and shout out a lot of the creativity as we get into the 1930s. 400 films produced a year during the 1930s. Between 1930 and 1950, studios dominated the landscape. It's almost like we've come full circle, right? We went from a very sort of like, I don't want to say restrictive, but certainly a very bubble-like existence for Hollywood back on the East Coast with Thomas Edison, just in these little 12-minute films. Now we have, broader narratives, we have broader structure, we have editing, etc. We have a lot of different things that are happening with film. But the fact is that the studios on the West Coast very much dominating this era. And in 1934, MGM had over 60 big name actors and focused on star-studded musicals. Gone with the Wind, obviously, probably their most famous, and Wizard of Oz, both made in 1939. Warner Brothers became best known for gangster films. 20th Century Fox was all about historical films. And there's just a number of different actors and whatnot that were basically under contract to these different studios that are just, legendary. John Wayne, Groucho Marx, Katharine Hepburn, etc. All right. Anyway, if you wanted to work in Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s, you belonged to a studio. And studios also controlled distribution, scheduling, and promoting. They even had their own chain of theaters. And the idea was to control from the idea that the movie was conceived to the box office. And this was something called vertical integration or vertical control. Something we'll talk about, by the way, in part 4, because it plays a very big part post-World War II, the idea of vertical integration and vertical control. So that is it for this part of film history. We'll finish off with the 1940s to present day in the final video on YouTube. So make sure that you click on that. And then once you've done all 4, obviously, you're going to want to look to see the various quizzes that are out there as part of this module and week 11 as well, to make sure that you successfully review your material so that you can do really well. Okay. All right. We'll see you on part 4.